but we did look at donations to other organizations as well. So let me tell you what we did, and then we can jump into the conclusions. So the first thing we wanted to do, of course, is to understand how the two types of donations move relative to each other. So we wanted to be able to, of course, in an ideal scenario, you would like to be able to randomly just move donations going into one cause and then see the impact on the other.
Welcome to The Ripple Effect, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the minds of Wharton faculty. I'm your host, Dan Loney, and in each episode, we'll be diving deep into the inspiration behind the groundbreaking research that Wharton professors have conducted and exploring how their findings resonate with the world today. Well, certainly the fall of 2024 will be remembered as a unique time in and around the area of charitable and political giving. Certainly we are seeing a high level of political giving right now, with it being a presidential election year. But you also now have the impact of Hurricane Helene, which will also lead to giving to various organizations looking to help out those impacted by the storm. But the question, which has been asked in the past and now is being asked again, is does one impact the other? Pleasure to be joined here in studio by Pinar Yildirim, who is an associate professor of marketing here at the Wharton School. She's been part of research looking at the correlation between these two types of giving. Great to see you again. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you for having me.
So the research that you did shows that there is an impact. Take us through what you did and what you found out.
Where we see significant amounts of money go into political donations. And naturally, we ask this question, why are we seeing so much money going into politics? What motivates people to give to politics? And can we explain that in any way, maybe in relationship to charitable giving, which we know a lot more about? And those are the type of questions that we wanted to answer. It's an important year. When we look at the numbers, we see these numbers going up compared to the previous years. For example, if you were to just look at the 2016 election year, the presidential candidates were collectively able to collect about $440 million in the first 12 months of the campaign. That number more than doubled in the 2020 election, going over $1.1 billion. So in general, we are seeing this trend. This is for political giving. We also see similar trends if you look at charitable donations. In last year, 2023, there were about $550 billion going into charitable giving. And that number is a significant hike compared to what we used to see 10, 15 years ago. For example, in 2010, we used to see about $300 billion going into charitable giving. So we asked this question again, what motivates people to donate? So we wanted to understand, again, the motivations to giving, but at the same time also wanted to understand if we start seeing potentially an increase in one type of giving, what might be the impact on the other form of giving as well. So that's what we wanted to study.
And so then what did you find out? And part of the research you looked at was focused on giving to the American Red Cross, correct?
Yes. Our focus, or at least our primary data, was coming from the American Red Cross, but we did look at donations to other organizations as well. So let me tell you what we did, and then we can jump into the conclusions. So the first thing we wanted to do, of course, is to understand how the two types of donations move relative to each other. So we wanted to be able to, of course, in an ideal scenario, you would like to be able to randomly just move donations going into one cause and then see the impact on the other. But in real world, of course, being able to see these effects in random ways is almost impossible. So we looked at events that happen in the world that almost randomly or random-like fashion increase the motivations to give to one type of cause, and then we can look at the effects on the other. So for natural disasters, right, if you think about it, these events typically happen in very unexpected ways. They happen and their devastation is usually not calculable in advance. Especially foreign disasters that take place in faraway lands, they can act as reminders to give to charity, or how important donations to charitable organizations might be at the time of giving. These events get plenty of or ample amounts of coverage on media, and therefore could increase the motivations to giving to charity, at least in temporary ways. So we took advantage of foreign natural disasters, large disasters, and we looked at the increase in the American Red Cross donations around the time of or in the weeks that follow these natural events. And then at the same time, looking at the Federal Elections Commission data on political donations, we looked at the response in political giving as well. So what we have seen was in the weeks, the 6 weeks roughly, that follow a large foreign natural disaster, you see about a 34 to 35% increase in the American Red Cross donations. And the corresponding decline in the political donations is about 18 to 19%.
Right.
So just to summarize it again, we see an increase in charitable giving or disaster response giving, and then we see a decline in the political donations.
Does it happen to go the reverse way in a situation where you have a political event going on and maybe you don't necessarily have the natural disaster that occurs?
Yeah, so exactly the same way of you framing that question, we also wanted to understand the flip side of the coin. If we start seeing, for example, events that motivate giving to politics, do we see a response in charitable giving as well? And again, finding events that will randomly increase the motivations to political giving is somewhat hard, but we can look at events that impact individuals or voters in ways that are almost random. For example, we can look at political advertising. We took advantage of some of the characteristics or institutional features of political giving or the media markets. In general, in the United States, if you want to buy advertising, you typically buy them, especially TV advertising, by focusing on geographic areas that are called as designated media market areas. Designated market areas, DMAs, these are areas that are defined by the company Nielsen, and the boundaries of these markets are typically independent of the administrative boundaries. So what that means is you could be living, or two individuals could be living on two opposite sides of a designated market area boundary, and they could receive very different amounts and very different types of political ads. And we take advantage of those boundaries. We simply do a comparison of the individuals who fall, again, somewhat randomly, who fall on two sides of that boundary, and compare how someone who might have been exposed to higher levels of political advertising might be increasing or changing their giving to politics, and at the same time how that person responds in charitable giving. And what we see is, just to quantify that, about a 10% increase in the political ad spending. So political ad spending typically determines what you can buy in essentially a market area. A 10% increase roughly corresponds to about a 0.2% increase in giving to politics, and at the same time a 0.4% decline in giving to charity. So the amounts look slightly maybe different in terms of the magnitudes, but if you actually do a calculation, a comparison of how charitable giving responds to increase in political events, and do the opposite, how political giving responds to these charitable or disaster events, we see somewhat comparable responses.
Do people, and you mentioned the historical numbers in terms of total giving, do people feel like their money has more of an impact now than maybe they did 20, 30 years ago, or is it just kind of the natural course of the funds that we have available to us that we're willing to give to either case, whether it be political, whether it be a charitable donation as well?
Yes.
Do people feel like it has more of an impact these days?
Yeah, so if we reframe your question, I think we should ask what might be the motivation to giving, or what might be explaining potentially the substitution that we observe. Right? One sort of simple explanation could be that people have limited budget, and as they start giving to one cause, they start decreasing the amount for another cause. That, of course, is an explanation that we cannot rule out for everyone, right? There could be some individuals who indeed, just because of budgetary considerations, start giving to one cause and start taking away from the other one. But we did look at spending or the response in other items. For example, we looked at how retail spending or spending on groceries or spending on lottery items, lottery tickets, etc., which tend to be a lot more, hedonic type of spending. We looked at how people's other spending responds to both the political giving as well as the charitable giving. So while we cannot rule out, of course, individuals giving because of budgetary considerations, one thing we have done is we looked at also spending in other categories. For example, we looked at retail spending.
Right.
We looked at grocery spending. We looked at buying lottery tickets, which of course is not something that you have to do, right? It's
Right.
something that you can decide to buy. We did not see the same response. When we look at, for example, the increase in charitable giving, you do not see a decline in the spending items of these sorts. So we therefore think that it should not, or the substitution that we observe should not be solely explainable by the budget considerations. But there could be other motivations that are potentially driving the pattern that we observe. Now, one potential explanation is something that relates to charitable giving. Right? When you look at motivations for charitable giving, typically the literature will put those motivations in two very broad buckets.
Right.
One is the idea that I'm very altruistic. I really want the betterment of others. I care about the welfare of others, and therefore I give. Right? I give because I want you to be better.
Right.
The other set of motivations typically fall under impure altruism, or what the economists and the academics like to call warm glow. I give because it makes me feel good.
Sure.
Because I give because I get some kind of status out of giving. Maybe I'm recognized as a donor somewhere, or I feel good about myself because I do something good for others. So for the individuals who are giving primarily because of the impure altruism or warm glow motivations, you don't really care if ultimately the money that you're giving is helping others to recover from a disaster,
Right.
or doing something else.
Right.
So if the motivations for giving to the two types of charities, or if the primary motivations of giving is warm glow or feeling better about yourself, you could feel better about yourself from giving to charity, and you might get a similar enjoyment, similar utility out of giving to politics as well. So if motivations are warm glow, we could potentially explain why people give to one cause versus the other.
So the political cycle is unique in this process because obviously it's not just the day or the week before the election. It's obviously a long run-up process in order to get to that point. And as you mentioned before, there's a lot of political advertising that will be on different platforms. That, I would assume, has then an impact kind of in a longer framework on how people think about their giving at that particular time, whether they're giving to a political campaign versus a charitable giving. And I'm wondering if it has a longer impact potentially to the detriment of the charitable organization, that they lose out on funds from individuals over a longer period of time because that election cycle is such a longer cycle.
Yeah, so I hear, I think, three sort of separate questions in what you just asked. One is, of course, the idea of, is there any difference across the time period? For instance, going into getting closer to the elections, do we see a different level of impact? Because of the aggregation in our study of the time periods, we wanted to look at donation response over a number of weeks. We don't necessarily we were not able to observe these type of differences.
Right.
But certainly I could speculate that if somehow we are sending more reminders about the importance of donating to politics to individuals, or if we are elongating the periods over which people are constantly reminded of the need to give to politics, that could have a negative impact on the nonprofits that are trying to raise money for charitable causes, as well as the victims of these disasters, because they're not going to be able to receive the same level of funds that they could have received otherwise.
What do you think were your most important takeaways in looking at these components of giving from the outside?
So I think a couple of important takeaways. First, we want to understand the motivations to giving to politics, because as I mentioned earlier, this is not entirely clear. It's relatively understudied compared to charitable giving. We understand the motivations to give to charitable giving, but we don't know what political donations are really for. Or if some academics, some researchers suggest that people give because they expect something in return, right? This is an instrumental motivation. You're donating because maybe you think that the politician will return that favor in the future. Or Some others suggested that people give because they think it's their civic duty. Others suggested that people give because they get some consumption value out of that. So there could be different explanations, of course, or different suggestions as to why people give. But it's important to underline the common elements with charitable giving. And I think that's one of the first things that we do. We see that these forms of giving are substitutes. The second, I think, important takeaway for us is the relative negative impact of these two forms of giving on the other, right? So we are observing that if there is an event that drives charitable giving, disaster giving in particular, we will see a negative impact on political donations. And that's not just coming from the budget effect. It seems to come from other factors as well, just like the warm glow effects that motivate people for giving. To quantify that, we see that if there's an increase of $1 that goes to charitable giving, that results in about a 42-cent decline in the political donations. Now, looking at the other side, we also see that political events that drive political giving could have a negative impact on charitable donations, and that could be potentially a negative outcome for both nonprofits as well as disaster victims. To quantify that effect, we see that if there's a $1 increase or events that drive political donations result in a $1 increase in political giving, that corresponds to about a 33-cent decline that's going to charitable giving. So it's a sizable amount, and I think we need to be aware of these potential responses that come from the other causes of giving. And a third thing that we discuss at the end of our study, which we care about, is this question about the effect of money in politics, right? As we were starting, I mentioned that the political donations are increasing. A non-significant, non-trivial amount of those donations come from individual donors, and that seems to have increased over the last election cycles as well. So the question comes down to, well, should we rethink about the policies that restrict giving to politics? Is this too much money?
Right.
And if there's too much money or too many political donations, does that really change the electoral dynamics in some way? Right? Could it be potentially benefiting some politicians more than others? And in discussing this topic, typically we care about a concept called incumbency advantage. I think for our listeners it might be potentially a familiar concept, but in brief, it just simply describes this idea that politicians who have access to resources, who have been in an office before, who've been elected before, who essentially are an incumbent, they tend to get reelected again and again when you look at the United States elections as well as in other countries as well. We don't like the idea of incumbency advantage too much unless the incumbent gets elected again and again because they are the better candidates. We don't like it if it's coming from some resource advantage because that means we have less competitive elections, and some of the really good candidates, potentially high-quality politicians, they may not be able to get ground, they may not be able to get elected, and they may not eventually be able to benefit the public with their policies. So looking at the question of money, right? Small and large amounts of money that go into donations and how that potentially influences incumbency advantage, that's also something that we do in this study. And here, charitable donations are really useful, or disaster events are really useful because they create an exogenous or unexpected change in the money that goes to politics.
Right.
Therefore, we can look at the response in terms of the electoral chances of incumbents and challengers. And perhaps surprisingly, or at least differently from some of the earlier studies in the literature, we find that actually more money in politics is not necessarily bad. When we look at the chances of getting elected by an incumbent as well as a challenger, we see that if we can increase the total pot of money, that is, if we can have more donations, more money going into politics, we actually are able to increase the chances of a challenger getting elected. So about a 10% increase in donations results in about a 3.6 percentage point, if I recall correctly, increase in the chances of a challenger getting elected, which again, if we believe in more competitive elections where everybody has the chance to go and run and get elected, which should be a positive outcome for the society.
Pinar, great to have you with us and to go over all of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
You got it. Pinar Yildirim, Associate Professor of Marketing here at the Wharton School. Thank you for listening to The Ripple Effect. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more insightful conversations by subscribing to the Wharton School's Ripple Effect podcast on your favorite podcast platform.